those key recognition features on the T55, bore evacuator way towards the front of the muzzle there. At the end of the day, T55, T62, it's all about the gun. That spacing in the road wheels on the T55, the spacing right at the front there, the general overall shape of the turret and the welded cast plates versus that one piece cast off the T62.
Hey Scott, we got 0.6 centimeters between the lettering on the serial number.
Oh, alright. Well, I got 4.14 micromillimeters. So, how many rivets have you got so far?
I counted 3,871.6 rivets.
Well, I got 3,876.2 rivets. So it's different. Yeah?
Looks so.
Count it again. All right? Okay, rivet counters, this one's not for you, all right? No more. That's it. We're just going to talk about the basics. We're not counting rivets. We have the T55 AMS, which is a very heavy Polish modification, and then we have a mod 1972 T62 A used by the Syrian army. Now these tanks, they have evolved quite some way from their base when the Soviets actually built them. So we're not going to focus on specific upgrades that the Polish might have done for the Merida system or what the Syrians were doing. We're just focusing on the nuts and bolts T55, T62 without getting into too much further depth on the different variants.
Alright, it's a T54, T55 was produced from 1946, and according to some sources it was produced about 100,000 of them.
Then T62 was produced 1961, and there's estimates of between 19 and 22,000 of these ones. Technically, this could be referred to as a variant of T55. However, due to the extensive changes that they did make, it basically became T62. And the reason we have such similarities between the two tanks is at the time, T64 was well under design and production, but I say pre-production, but the production phase just wasn't quite ready yet to push those out. So the reason the T62 came about was more of a stopgap to create, level out the playing field. So when the British and the Americans came out with the 105 L7 gun, they pushed this thing into production really quickly. So that is basically why these two tanks are so similar in a lot of ways. And now we're going to get into those differences between the two.
So this is our T55 late style track.
And then the T62 that we have has the earlier style track with the pins, no rubber bushings or bolts. This isn't necessarily a difference between either of the tanks. Both styles of track were used on both tanks. It just depends on what the country's availability was when they did their upgrades. On the width of this thing, given that they measure out at exactly the same distance in width, I can tell you that in the driver's seat inside the T55 is significantly much more cramped than the T62. So now we know that distance, we're going to get inside and we're going to figure out where that lack of space is actually coming from. My guess is that the fuel tanks and ammunition storage, perhaps there's a different width in those front fuel tanks. We'll find out.
So we're inside the T55. We're measuring from the battery box over to the sidewall. There is the nuclear protection layer right here, which is roughly an inch thick. But right now we're measuring at about 31.5 inches. So in the T55, the one of the reasons it may feel smaller, well, it does feel smaller inside of here, is that we have this post right here, which might be some sort of structural beam, and then we also have the fire suppression control box, which in the T62 is actually located forward and kind of more out of the way.
Alright, so now we're inside the T62, and as you can already see, I'm basically sprawled out like I'm in a lounge chair. But measuring from those same spots, just below the dash on the battery box, it's only 33 inch. So some of that distance might just be taken up by that nuclear protection sheet the T55 has. This one does not have that. But yeah, I'm shocked as well. I don't know where this extra room is coming from, but we don't have that big post here right next to the driver. And that fire suppression control box is also being moved up under the front here, so we do have a little bit more space here. There's room here for an ammunition box for the PKT, but other than that, as far as the driver's hull goes, it is basically the same. It just, I don't know why it feels so much more cramped inside the T55, but this tank definitely feels much more spacious.
So one of the most common and popular ways to tell the T55 to the T62 is actually the gap space that we have between these two road wheels, which is in the front of the T55 compared to the T62.
So T62, that gap is actually moved towards the rear of the tank, and rather than one big gap, you have 3 road wheels evenly spaced, and then you have this gap broken up, and that road wheel in the middle to take up the difference. And I guess that's where our added length of the vehicle comes from, and that's how they configured the track to take up that weight distribution.
So on the T55, one of the differences between this tank and the T62, if you come in here, you'll notice that this kind of has an overhang over the turret ring, and that has to do with the shape of the turret itself.
Okay, so back on the T62, being that the key aspect difference of this tank is the gun, in order to accommodate that gun, there is a much wider turret ring and different turret shape. So starting at the base of the turret ring, that recess that takes the turret, it sticks out far wider.
All right, another one of the differences between the T55 and the T62 is this right here. Even though this is a Polish variant, the Soviet variant is more or less the same concept. And what you're looking for is these weld seams right here, as well as the bolts holding this in.
This turret being wider and a one-piece cast as opposed to welded, you can see there's no seams here, and the recess for the cupola is actually just machine cut into the top of the turret. So again, T62 completely cast down the side there.
So over on the back of the T55, I'd like to point out a couple of differences between the T55 and the T62. Pay note of the angle right here on the back deck. It's angled slightly this way, as well as down here, the back of the engine bay is not straight, it is angled itself. Another note while you're down here is to pay attention to the difference of length between the T55 and the T62.
So here we are at the back of the T62. Take note, this time there are no rear angles or sloped angles. This one, it just drops straight down. So as most of you know, in the armor world, the sloped armor is there to help deflect rounds, but at the time this came out with the technology and armor piercing ammunition and the fact that we're at the rear of the tank, it might not have been so important anymore to get that sloped armor at the rear, because when you have a slope in the tank, you lose space. So perhaps they got rid of that rear engine bay angle to open up more space inside the engine bay, thus having that straight drop off down here at the rear.
So one of the differences that we noticed, and we don't know if it's specifically to the T55 or the T62, but on our T55 versus the T62, there is a difference in the mounts for the Dushka. One of the noticeable features on this is on this back plate here, you have like a triangle shaped mount, and the T62 does not actually have that. Another important feature that is, you'll see that you only have these two shocks right here. The T62 actually has a extra set of shocks on the top that you'll see. And then the mounting itself, the pin in this is actually a lot different than the one that goes on the T62. And once again, we don't know if that is a difference between the two models of tanks, or maybe it's just a different model of Dishika mount, but something to note. Another difference between the two Dishika mounts is how it actually clamps to the Dishika. This has more of like a fold down clamp style, and as you'll see in a minute, the T62 actually has a different way of mounting. These just screw onto here and close down versus the T62.
On the T62 for the 12.7 mount, the noticeable differences that we've seen so far is this one actually has two buffers or miniature shocks that sit at the front of the trunnion mount to absorb some of that recoil. As you saw on the T55 mount, that's a standard fixed point. Once again, we're not as knowledgeable with the 12.7 mounts themselves. So whether this is a specific difference to the two tanks, I'm not sure. I doubt it. It's probably more to do with just upgrading in general. However, one thing we can be certain of is the mount up style of these mounts to each tank. As you saw on the T55, it's more of a post style mount. T62 at the base of this one is a giant cup with a dowel, like a locating dowel that drops in at 90 degrees and then it locks into place. It does bring the mount somewhat a little bit lower. Why they did that, I'm not quite sure. Maybe to keep the loader a little bit further down inside the turret when he's under fire. But that is, to our surprise, an interesting difference between the two tanks. Okay, so we talked about the differences before in the turrets, but now we have a blueprint that we can actually show for you. So looking here at T55, you can see that drastic difference in the actual the width of the turret. So when they say this thing is wider, this is really what they're talking about. And obviously being T62, they had to do this to accommodate that much larger gun. But at a glance, spotting the differences between the two, the T55 is actually a multi-piece welded turret. So when you look at a T55 turret, you'll actually see a weld seam very prominent up through the middle here, and then you'll see your weld seams around the sides here, and then obviously of course one across the back, and there's those prominent bolt marks that we were talking about on the cupola. Okay, so in addition to those bolt holes we just spoke about, notice that the T55, the turret is, I guess, more of an egg shape, and it thins out towards the front here, whereas T62 is that perfect concentric circle. That is a huge noticeable difference once you're inside. And then earlier today, when we referenced the that overhang and we cross-referenced that known point of the fuel tank, you can see here it lines up very close to the edge of that fuel tank right there, whereas T62, it almost comes out well over halfway of that known reference point, which is the same on both tanks. Other than that, we also have the well-known auto eject feature of the T62. There's that auto eject door for it. We're going to touch on that. We also have our vent fan port here on T62, which is not prominent on the T55. And basically, at a quick glance, that's the major differences between the two turrets. As you look at the top of a T62 turret, there's no weld seam, so we don't have that seam running down the middle. It's just a perfect cast. No seam at the back here. So that missing seam at the back here, we actually have much more angle out this way to compensate for the rear of the gun, and of course that infamous ejector tray.
So an important difference that's more noticeable if you're actually inside of the turret and more likely a crew member would be the length of the preheater. The T55 has a lot longer of a preheater than the T62, which you'll see in a moment. And it extends all the way up to like where the gunner is.
Okay, so now inside the T62 in the crew compartment, that same preheater we just looked at, you can see here it is noticeably much smaller. It's actually recessed a little bit further back in behind the turret, closer to the firewall. And then the main difference is that burner unit is significantly shortened, much more. And then the layout of your components for your pump motor and the pump itself, it's essentially configured to make a much shorter unit. So the crew commander has a little bit more legroom and space immediately below his feet, and maybe the gunner has some space where he's sitting a little bit more. The gun itself, other than the fact that it is a smoothbore, the breech ring itself is generally the same design and same concept as the T55. However, one major difference is your recoil system and replenisher is actually being relocated from the top of the gun all the way down to underneath the gun. So later on, we're actually going to measure the difference in how much you can lower the gun. Hazarding it a guess at the first glance, if they've relocated those recoil cylinders from the T55 at the top of the gun there, we've gained a little bit of extra space. So by relocating those down under the gun, maybe we'll be able to gain a little bit more depression in our angle. So later on today, we're actually going to measure that and see how it pans out.
So, as first thing you might notice is the how more compact the inside of the turret is. From like shoulder to shoulder, you're always touching something. Even the back of the turret, it's a lot like closer. The other thing to mention is the recoil system. As Scott mentioned, it is actually on top of the gun versus the T62, which edges right underneath.
T55 does still feature that kind of that rear turret basket area, but no auto eject tray. And then moving up here to the auto eject door, which you've seen previous, the exterior vent fan.
The basket, while it doesn't have the same auto eject system as the T62, it still does have a basket tray that extends to the back right here.
Okay, another one is the location of your power assist motor. As opposed to being forward up underneath in front of the gunner, they've moved it to the rear of the crew commander now. So that's it right there. And then obviously these mechanisms here for the auto eject features, they're not there in the T55. So looking at, we discussed before the distance of the turret ring itself. You can see here when you're inside the tank, it is noticeably much wider. So you have that throw right out underneath there. And because the turret isn't edge shaping towards the front, all the gunner's controls is actually pushed further out in this direction, so he does have a lot more space, and it's less cramped than the T55.
So as you can see, the turret ring, as Scott mentioned on the T62, is a lot farther out compared to on the T55 right here. It is literally just right there. There's not room underneath. It's a lot tighter of a fit.
So much to my surprise, that difference in moving the recoil cylinders from the top of the gun to the bottom of the gun has done what appears to be almost nothing to gain any extra depression in the gun. So maybe they did that because of the changes in the gun design itself, and they relocated those recoil cylinders, or perhaps it's a balance issue. Someone out there hopefully might be able to answer us on that one. Now let's check elevation. Alright, so as you can see, the difference in elevation is also almost minimal. The T55 is slightly, just a little bit higher. At this point, I'm guessing when we're looking at the elevation gearbox itself, the part numbers are almost exactly the same in terms of the gear knuckle and the track that it travels on. We're limited by the amount of space there. So yeah, you have equal elevation and depression almost.
So the suspension difference between the T55 and the T62, as you'll see in a minute, is very slightly. The T55 being about 31.5 inches, give or take, with ground differences, while the T62 measures in at 34 inches. One of the reasons that they may sit higher, the T62 being slightly higher than the T55, is that the T62 actually has an upgraded suspension system, which will allow for more travel on the torsion arm bars. The thing to note is the weight difference. They're not that far apart, the T55 being about 36 tons and the T62 being about 37 tons.
Alright, so at the end of the day, T55, T62, it's all about the gun. Here we are, the long-awaited moment. So we have the D10 100mm rifled bore, and then the upgraded 115mm 2A20 smoothbore gun.
So at a glance, you'll notice that the placement of the bore evacuator is on the very front of the gun itself.
And then here we are on T62, that bore evacuator that serves the exact same purpose is now rescinded back off the front of the gun, maybe to about 3/4 of the way up the gun from the turret. Alright guys, so that's basically a wrap. I hope you've enjoyed what we've done today. So at a quick summary, those key recognition features on the T55, the bore evacuator way towards the front of the muzzle there, slightly rescinded on the T62 about 3/4 of the way up from the turret. That spacing in the road wheels on the T55, the spacing right at the front there, moved to the back of the T62 and opened up with that second to last road wheel. The general overall shape of the turret and the welded cast plates versus that one piece cast off the T62. So at a quick summary, that's the best way to get the differences between the two. A note on the differences and then the similarities is when the T62 first appeared on the battlefield with that 115 smoothbore, it was a ferocious gun and very effective against anti-armor. So tank crews that trained in enemy vehicle recognition had a reason to panic when this tank appeared on the battlefield. That being said, because they look so similar, even through a tank telescope at distance, when the vehicle's moving or through shade or in a convoy or dust, it's not always going to be possible to spot those key recognition features. So, and there is instances during the Golan Heights Yom Kippur War with the T62 here, they were held back initially and held in reserve until further waves as the war progressed. Once these appeared, it created a little bit more panic there with the Israelis. So that is obviously a feature to be worried about when you're facing up against a mix of T55, T62. So that's it.
Well, thanks for watching and stay tuned for more content.